Hey, class, greetings. Jacob, hey. Mason, nice to see everyone. How's everyone doing? Jacob Dunn, nice to see you and everyone else. I hope y'all had a good spring break. How's everyone doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Thank you. I'm on campus. I'm in my office on campus. Just to mix it up a little bit. Yeah. It's good to see everyone. Let's see here. Y'all, hope everyone's good. Let's see. Do I have any housekeeping items? Yes. First off, I'm glad that we're going to have a presentation on Wednesday. David Newsom is going to present on Anselm / the ontological argument. So I'm very excited about that. Speaking of, well, we'll come back to presentations and stuff in a minute. Hope you had a good spring break. We are going to press on with our reading schedule, which I'm about to pull up in a minute. Before I do that, let me just say that oh yeah, let me say that right now I'm leaning toward having class on campus next week. I will confirm that on Wednesday. And if y'all have any more input for me, please let me know. I mean, I'm interested in knowing what works best for you and what your desire is. From my point of view, meeting online is barely worth it. It's barely worth it. It is worth it, but just barely. So that's one thing. The other thing is I am planning on having an end of the semester party at my house. It would be great if y'all, were to come. Please know that you're invited. Mason, have you ever been to my house?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, cool. I can't remember because I've done this before. I didn't do it last semester because of the pandemic, but I'm going to do it this time. I'll announce that date. I'm going to invite my other class, my intro class that has over 40 people in it. And so, yeah, that'd be kind of cool if y'all were to come to that. More details to come. And then I think the last thing I want to say has to do with C.S. Lewis and the discarded image. So let me go ahead and share my screen and pull up the reading schedule real quick. And then if y'all have any questions, I hope that you will let me know. It always kind of bums me out when people ask me questions after the class. No offense, but like everyone needs to hear these questions, believe me. Yeah, my last little housekeeping thing involves looking at the reading schedule. And with particular focus on the discarded image by C.S. Lewis, which we're going to start today. I'm very excited about that. And y'all, what it says on the reading schedule, I think that this is accurate. Well, let me put it this way. I mean, we're behind a little bit, but I don't think that I need to revise anything on here, as I think. But you'll see that we had originally sort of allocated 2 weeks for the discarded image. We're gonna, in other words, 4 classes, but we're gonna scrunch that into 3. So we're gonna do C.S. Lewis today, Wednesday, and next Monday. Then next Wednesday of next week, we're gonna move on to the Pieper book, Guide to Thomas Aquinas. And again, same thing. We were gonna spend 4 classes on that. We're gonna spend 3, okay? So hopefully Monday, 3 weeks from today, we will be basically caught up, okay? Because I think that way we can spend a week on Aquinas's 5 Ways, maybe 2 weeks on Bonaventure. Maybe we'll figure it out. I think that what we'll be forced to do is to spend 2 weeks on Bonaventure instead of 3, but we will figure that out. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. I hope that y'all have read C.S. Lewis and that you have found it interesting. Now, before we launch into C.S. Lewis, and actually I want to upload something to Canvas real quick, but while I'm doing that, does anyone have any questions? Any thoughts or questions for me?
You were talking about having class next week in class.
Correct. Yep.
What about the strictly online students?
Right. So thank you for asking. And there's 3 of y'all, and Jacob Dunn, you were one of them. My thought is that I don't really know how to do this. Like, see, I didn't have to think through that issue whenever, in fact, if I'm honest, that's one of the reasons why I chose to just be online. So I didn't have to figure out how to do the hybrid thing. I don't know how to do it. I think what I'm going to do is just have my MacBook open and record myself. And basically it'll be a lot like what I do now, except that hopefully there will be some folks sitting around a table with me. You know what I mean? Does that make sense, Jacob? And what do you think about that?
I think that'll work. I think your microphone should be good enough to pick up you talking and everybody else. So I think that'll work well.
Yeah, the downside is exactly that. We'll see what happens. And oh, by the way, if any of you online students want to swing by, that would be great as well. But you're certainly not required to. We'll see what happens. And if you know, it may be that my boss, Greg Bach, has some advice for me along these lines. I honestly don't know how. Has anyone had a hybrid class before?
I had one last semester.
With Griffin Nelson?
Well, not in the religious department.
Okay.
I had it in history. And he just kind of like, he did a Zoom thing in his classroom.
Yeah.
But recorded it and posted it later.
Yeah, which is essentially what I'm proposing. It's just that I'm too lazy / busy to get it professionally produced, which the university probably offers. But I'm just going to use my MacBook unless it's unacceptable, in which case I'll reach out and get some help. Okay. But I think it'll work out. Y'all, are there any other questions while I look for my notes on the discarded image to post to Canvas? Any other thoughts? Come on. Up, there we go. Okay. Cool. One sec here. You will see that these notes contain more than just the sections that that I assigned, that I asked you guys to read. Yeah, that's for your own edification. Although I am going to discuss something with these notes that I didn't assign you to read, because I think I screwed up and I forgot to assign you to read it. I think I originally wanted you to, and then I forgot to actually tell you. But we'll get to that in a moment, okay? Y'all, let's delve into the discarded image, shall we? This is what my copy of the book looks like. Excuse me. This is what my copy of the book looks like. C.S. Lewis, I'm a big fan. The book, it is kind of dated, but I also think that it's very, very helpful. By the way, we're switching gears. We're sort of radically switching gears, and we will switch gears again after we leave C.S. Lewis. This is not, strictly speaking, a work of philosophy. I would say it's more historical, maybe history of ideas stuff. C.S. Lewis was not a philosopher, although he was brilliant. I mean, he's a much better philosopher than anyone I've ever met is. But professionally, he was more of a literary critic, a scholar of Renaissance literature. But it's a good book, I think, in terms of getting a broad overview of the medieval world and the medieval mind. And yeah, let me say this. I think that if you know, I've already had y'all read the Confessions. We've looked at 3 different chapters of the Confessions, which I think was well worth our time. If I were to sort of let's say that I were to create a recommended reading list, which I did not do, but if I were to do that, I might put The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius on there. He discusses The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius in this book. C.S. Lewis is a big fan of that work. He points out that it was probably the most widely read text in the medieval world. And that's largely because prior to the rise of the university, we have already talked a little bit and are going to talk more about the University of Paris, which is one of the 3 oldest universities in Europe. Keep in mind that the university is a Christian institution historically. It emerged out of essentially cathedrals in important cities in Europe that monks would come and sort of flock to. That's how the University of Paris got started. That's how Oxford University, which is also one of the top 3 oldest in Europe, got started. The other one is the University of Bologna in Italy. I don't know as much about the history of that university, but it is the oldest one. But in every case, these are Christian institutions that emerged in cathedral cities because of the work that monks / friars were doing. In other words, men, all of whom were priests in the Catholic Church, all of whom had a vocation to celibacy. By the way, they weren't. I don't think that 100% of them were religious. There were probably a few secular priests as well, but the vast majority of them were monks or friars. Okay. As we're going to see when we get to the Pieper book about Thomas Aquinas, a friar is a kind of religious person who is mendicant in the sense that they take vows of poverty. And a friar typically has a vocation of teaching or some kind of service out in the world. In other words, they're not cloistered monks. So there's a little distinction between monk on the one hand and friar on the other, but they're almost kind of sort of for our purposes the same thing. But keep in mind that the university was a Christian institution. And so and it emerged, roughly in the 12th century. And so when I talk about Boethius, the Consolations of Philosophy, and by the way, you might not even know how to spell Boethius, so why don't I put that in the chat? And by the way, there is an index. There is an index in the discarded image, so you could look up Boethius in the index, and I'm doing that right now. And yeah, he talks about the Consolation of Philosophy from page 75 to 90, and elsewhere as well. But Boethius is a super important figure. And if I were to sort of create a list of recommended readings, I would put Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy on there. As C.S. Lewis points out, it was the most widely read text apart from the Bible itself throughout the Middle Ages in the medieval world. And prior to the emergence of the university, this would have taken place in monastery libraries. That's what I'm really trying to say. It was monastery libraries where people had access to the works of authors, or to use the Latin word that C.S. Lewis talks about on page 5, which was part of your reading, it was monastery libraries in which people had access to the auctores. The auctores. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Auctor, which is kind of an interesting word. You might think of it as kind of a cross between author on the one hand and authority on the other. In the medieval world, as we're going to discuss, they did not have the same skeptical mindset that we do. And so the primary way that they wanted to investigate truth was to listen to authorities. So that's in part what an auctor is. And a prime example of that would have been Boethius. And so where would people have access to Boethius's texts? Answer: monastery libraries, particularly prior to the emergence of the university in the 12th century. Now, keep in mind that these libraries, keep in mind that the printing press had not been invented. And so written texts were very rare. And because they were rare, they were also what? What happens to something when it's exceedingly rare?
It's valuable, expensive.
It's valuable and expensive, which is why in the medieval church, they would chain the parish Bible to the pulpit. Why? So that no one would steal it, because books and Bibles were so rare. So there's very few books in these monastery libraries. In fact, in a typical monastery library in the medieval world, there were probably around 100 books. That would have been a fairly well-stocked library. In my library, in my office that you guys have sort of seen, because I've done most of my Zoom lessons there, I probably have, I don't know, 2,500 books. So my library is way larger than the typical library of a medieval monastery, right? Nevertheless, one of the books that would have been in virtually every single medieval monastery is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Another optional text or recommended text that I could easily put on a syllabus if I were to teach this course in the future would be, anyone want to guess? Can anyone take a guess as to what possibly would be the second greatest medieval text that, and we're talking primary text, obviously, that someone might want to be acquainted with if they were to really get a grasp on the medieval world? And it's not the Bible. The Bible would be on there, but it's not the Bible, nor is it a work from Greek antiquity. I'm really only talking about books that were written in the medieval period, or maybe at the very beginning of the medieval period. Who wants to guess what a second text that I could recommend might be? Any thoughts about that?
I'll take a wild guess. City of God by Aquinas.
That is a City of God. What, Mason?
Isn't that by not what's his name? Augustine?
It is. It's by Augustine,
okay.
just like the Confessions are, and that would be a great one. Although the one that I have in mind, I think, is even better. And also, we've sort of read a text by Augustine, so I probably wouldn't put another one on the recommended reading list. But the answer is, and so that's a good guess. Anyone else want to take a wild guess as to what an extremely helpful text would be to wrap your mind around the medieval world? C.S. Lewis does mention it in this book. In fact, he mentions it a lot.
Dante?
That's right. Dante the Paradiso, aka I didn't mean to say Paradiso. I meant to say the Commedia. Dante's Commedia, aka the Divine Comedy. That's right, Michael. Super important, massive tome, broken down into 3 volumes: the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Very, very important. Almost like a microcosm of the entire medieval mind, the medieval world, or to use C.S. Lewis's word, the medieval model, M-O-D-E-L. Okay, so yeah, I could easily put those 2 texts on a recommended list of texts for this class. Alas, I did not. And so without further ado, why don't we take a deep dive into this text, C.S. Lewis, The Discarded Image, shall we? Yeah, and so Oh, I didn't upload it on Canvas yet. I'm going to upload these notes real quick. Forgive me. And I have to do it for both sections, which is a real pain, but oh well. Give me 1 sec here. These are my notes that I took about 5 years ago on the discarded image. One moment. Where did I put it? Where did I put it? Huh. All right. Okay, so one of the two sections should have it. Do y'all have that? Folks who are not in the online section?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, now I'm giving it to Jacob and company. Okay. You should both have it now. Good. I'm going to pull them up like this. Can y'all see this okay on my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so what I assigned was chapter 1, the medieval situation. By the way, if you look at the seminal period here, which is chapter 3, that's where he talks about Boethius right here. He has a lot to say about Boethius. But what I assigned was chapter 1, the medieval situation, chapter 7, the earth and her inhabitants. And then, if I recall correctly, what else did I assign?
It was 1, 5, and 7, I believe.
1, 5. Oh, good. Well, that's good. 1, 5, and 7. Oh, that's good. That's actually what I wanted to assign. Well, never mind then. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to stop confusing you and just start talking about chapter 1, the medieval situation. Okay. Thank y'all for that. Okay. So this is a sort of a broad overview, the medieval situation, chapter 1. I think that the basic thing that he's trying to say here is that when the popular imagination sort of thinks about the medieval world, we tend to think about dumb stuff. Do y'all know what Monty Python is? I barely do, but like, y'all know what Monty Python is? I think that's kind of what he's talking about. Like, we have this image of the medieval world, of medieval culture, where we think of, like, I don't know, the village idiot or some sort of dunce, or maybe that, what's that, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I don't know if you've seen that Disney movie when you were kids. Maybe Monty Python. We tend to think of stuff like that. C.S. Lewis also uses the word, what's the word he uses? Is it pagan? Savage. He says that when we think of medieval folks, we tend to imagine them as if they were savages, okay? And what's the sort of thing that we think of when we think of a savage? Well, look here at this first bullet point. What is a savage? They are unscientific and probably illiterate. And what savage people do is they tend to project all kinds of superhuman deities into the natural order, right? This is like how myths get started, like the myth of the corn god or the myth of the harvest. We're gonna invent a god because we want to have a good harvest, or we're gonna project a deity into the natural order in order to explain why earthquakes happen, right? This is the sort of thing that C.S. Lewis says is savage. This is the sort of thing that we imagine when we think of savages. They create rituals and practices which fill out and reinforce this belief system, okay? Now, what C.S. Lewis is saying is that's precisely not how the medievals were. Now, there might be some similarities. He goes into that a little bit, but look with me at this paragraph real quick. The medieval mind is almost completely different from this. For the medieval mind, its characteristic beliefs, practices, and values emerge not spontaneously from nature. Can you see how what I described a minute ago could be characterized as spontaneously emerging from nature? Like, I'm going to explain why earthquakes happen. I'm going to create a god. That would be emerging spontaneously from nature. But no, C.S. Lewis says that's not what's going on in the medieval world. Rather, what they're all about is not nature, but tradition. A long textual living tradition of interpretation, which is contained in what?
Old books.
Books, baby, books. What C.S. Lewis is saying is that this was a literate culture. Now, immediately we have to hit the pause button and remember that we are not dealing with democratic civilizations at all. So if we want to talk about the percentage of Americans who are literate, it's probably like, I don't know, 80, 90%. Not to say that everyone in the United States actually knows how to read, but still most of them could pronounce a sentence. Are you with me? The medieval world is very different. I mean, a very small percentage of people actually knew how to read, but among those who did know how to read, what they were into was books. Okay, so we could put it like this: the people with power. We're not talking about feudal underlings who were essentially slave labor, as unjust as that system is. This isn't a class on social justice. This is a class about ideas. And for the people who influenced ideas, they could read, they were literate, and what they valued, the way that they got their truth, we could say, was from books. Okay? Now that's different from the ancient world. I think that in the ancient world, if we were to ask who were the people who really powerfully propagated ideas into the culture, you'd probably have to talk about priests. Priests who probably invented myths. You would have to talk about poet-bard people like Homer and Hesiod. I think that the ancient Greek philosophers of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and even the pre-Socratics, are not the people who in their day radically influenced the culture. I think it was mainly myth makers, priests, people like that. But in the medieval world, it's the literate, it's academic types, especially in the universities. But even before that, I think that the same is true in the monasteries. People like St. Anselm. I mean, David Newsom is going to talk briefly about St. Anselm, despite the fact that he was not one of your required reading authors. And Anselm lived prior to the rise of the university. So did St. Augustine. These are people who relied on textual traditions, okay? And y'all, this is really the first point that C.S. Lewis is trying to make. The medievals were not savages. They weren't into these primordial myths that they could get into touch with, and therefore explain natural phenomena? No. Now, quick side note, as we're about to talk about, if those sorts of primordial myths were passed down to them in books and through a living tradition, then were they interested in those things? Yes, but they didn't make them up. They inherited them from previous generations of autores. Those autores do include pagan thinkers in the classical world of antiquity, Greece and Latin and Rome. Yes, that's true. But the reason they cared about those myths and rituals was because they inherited them. It's not because, in other words, their relationship to those myths and rituals is fundamentally different from the culture in which they emerged originally. Okay? Now, I hope that makes sense. We're going to now look at two examples that C.S. Lewis gives us of this, and I think that they're both fascinating. This is a good reason why I really like this book. But before we look at these two examples, namely Lasamon and the moon, does anyone have any thoughts? Does anyone have any thoughts, questions? Let me hit the pause button and just see if anyone wants to say anything. Y'all, we're definitely going to get through chapter 1 today, which is awesome. If we have time, I'd like to start and make some real progress on the chapter on the heavens. But does anyone have any thoughts, questions, comments right now before we look at these two examples that C.S. Lewis gives us? Am I making sense so far? I hope that you're with me. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep going then. C.S. Lewis gives us two examples that exemplify the very thing that he's talking about. The fact that what the medieval mind cares about is received authority, or you might say truth that is mediated through received authorities in the form of books/texts, okay? One of them is this guy named, well, one of them is the example of daimons. You can see that word right here on the outline, right? Now, does anyone recall an example in the world of philosophy? And I'll just give you another hint, classical philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, where we hear about daimons.
Didn't Socrates have one that would tell him not to do and say certain things?
He did have one. And so the medievals knew that, because even before, remember how I made a big deal a few weeks ago out of the fact that the manuscripts and even translations and even like copies of Aristotle, I made a big deal out of the fact that those were rediscovered in the 13th century. Remember that? That's important. And do you remember how the same thing is also true for the text of Plato? Now there were a very small number of texts from both authors that the medievals, that the Latin-speaking medievals had continuous access to. Does anyone remember what any of those examples are?
The Timaeus.
That's right. The Timaeus was the only Platonic dialogue that was never lost, if you will. That's right. Which means that the dialogues in which we hear about Socrates' daimon, in particular the Apology, I would say, they didn't have access to those actual texts, but they still knew about it, okay? They knew about it from other authors, from commentaries on the dialogues, et cetera, okay? So they didn't have the texts where Socrates speaks of a daimon, but they had other texts which talked about that, okay? Now, the medievals believed in this stuff. They believed in spirits that populated the world. And in particular, right now, we're talking about the world under the moon, the sublunar world. We'll come back to that in a moment, the sublunar world. But they did believe in this stuff. Now, did they invent these creatures in order to explain natural phenomena? No, they did not. They believed in them because they received them through a chain of tradition, which originated with someone like Plato, okay? So the medieval author that C.S. Lewis talks about is this person named Latzemon. I don't know how to say it, and it's not a Z, it's a Greek zeta, I think. Anyway, so the medievals did believe in these spirits that inhabited the world. If you're thinking, if this reminds you of like fairies, like Tinkerbell, that is a good instinct. That is a good instinct. They did believe in these things. They did not, as we're going to see soon, the existence of these other creatures did not threaten their belief in God. It did not threaten their belief in monotheism at all. We will talk about that soon. But they did believe in these creatures. They believed in angels and demons and fairies and all sorts of creatures that populate the earth that aren't simply physical biological creatures that science deals with. Okay? So you remember how we talked about how for Aristotle, all the things in the world can be described as what? Can someone remind me?
Made up of a combination of what is it called? The prime matter and form.
Good. Now, I wouldn't say prime matter, although that's not clearly wrong. Let's just say matter and form. That's right, Michael. And the language that I like to use because it's helpful is that for Aristotle, all the things in the world are concrete particulars, aka composite unities of form and matter. That's the best way to say it. And remember that for the tradition of Neoplatonism, which is virtually what all medievals were, including St. Augustine, who we saw quoting Plotinus ad nauseum when we read Chadwick's version of the Confessions, remember that virtually all medievals are Neoplatonists, and Neoplatonists were Aristotelians, so they would have picked up and they would have picked up what Aristotle put down here, okay? They would have agreed with Aristotle that yes, the things of the world that we can see with our eyes and perceive with our senses, our eyes, our ears, our touch, yes, they would have agreed with Aristotle that those things are concrete particulars of form and matter, but not these creatures. These creatures are different. These creatures are mysterious. If they are materially constituted at all, it's unclear what the nature of that material constitution is. Maybe they're not materially constituted at all, or maybe they have something like aerial bodies. We're not sure. They seem to live in the mountains and way up in the sky and maybe in the clouds. You might think of them as fairies. You might think of them as daimons, but they did believe in them. And they got them from this tradition of classical antiquity that begins with Plato, according to C.S. Lewis, okay? Now, look with me at the second bullet point here. This is probably the second example. It's related to the first example. But the second example that C.S. Lewis gives us of a belief that was widespread, virtually unanimous and universal in the medieval world, the second example that C.S. Lewis gives us is the example of the orbit of the moon, okay? This is related to the previous point about daimons. But what he's saying is that, would someone like to tell me what he's saying? We've actually kind of sort of previewed it or glimpsed it at various moments in the past already in this class. For example, when we read Aristotle's Metaphysics, his deduction of the unmoved mover. Would someone like to tell me what C.S. Lewis says about the moon? The moon is kind of like a boundary. The orbit of the moon is kind of like a boundary between two different realms. What are the two different realms that the orbit of the moon separates?
Is it nature and ether?
Yes, that would be one way of saying it. That's exactly right. Did you say nature and ether, Jacob?
Yes, I did.
Oh, okay, good. That was Jacob Levels. Thank you, Jacob. Very good. Yeah, you could put it that way. And so the realm of nature is stuff that what? Think Heraclitus.
Stuff that changes or moves.
That's right. Stuff that changes or moves, like plants, animals, leaves on an autumn day that fall from the tree and get blown by the wind. Stuff that moves, right? The realm of growth and decay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, that's the realm of nature. The word that Aristotle uses is physios. I have a copy of my book, Metaphysics, but Aristotle also wrote a book called Physics. And what's that about? It's about the realm of nature, stuff that moves. And that is everything that is beneath the moon. That is the realm of the sublunar, okay? Now, if that's true for the realm of the sublunar, then who can talk to me about what's true for the realm of what C.S. Lewis calls the translunar, or that which is beyond the orbit of the moon? What's up with that?
That's where the like perfect heavenly bodies are, like unchanging planets. They're perfectly spherical. They move around in perfect circles. Things are great up there.
That's it. And they seem to think, although I think that there's, what you can say is that there's a question, there tends to be a question about to what extent are these heavenly bodies divine, right? I mean, if you read Aristotle, I think that they seem divine, and what does that mean? Not quite sure, but wow, they're very close. They're way closer to God than we are. I do want to point out that I don't at all disagree with C.S. Lewis. I mean, far be it from me to disagree with C.S. Lewis, but I do think that it's interesting that when we read the Confessions, we did see a couple of instances where Augustine, I don't want to say that Augustine disagrees with this or sort of contradicts Aristotle, but he definitely does. There are points in the Confessions that we read where Augustine treats the heavenly bodies, the stars, the galaxy, he treats them in the same vein as other aspects of our everyday world of nature. And I think that, so that seems kind of like a contradiction. And, if that seems like a contradiction to you, then that's not a bad thing, because it means that you're paying attention and you understand what's going on. I would just say that there's also a tendency for some thinkers like Augustine. There's always, let me put it to you like this. What C.S. Lewis is rightly doing is calling attention to the continuity between the medievals, like, for example, Thomas Aquinas on the one hand, and these ancient authorities / sources on the other, right? C.S. Lewis is calling attention to the continuity, and he's right to do that. However, it's also true that some of this stuff does get undermined. So I think that Augustine doesn't think that the stars are divine. Augustine thinks that the stars are God's creatures. And actually, it may be that Michael has some exposure to this, because remember how part one of the Confessions is Augustine's own biography, but then part two is the biography of the world, the universe, the cosmos, right? AKA the biography of, you might say, creation, or the creation. And so Augustine does he spills lots of ink talking about the cosmos as a whole. And I think it might be at the beginning of book 12, I can't remember, Michael might know. He does talk a little bit about the book of Genesis. He talks a little bit about Genesis 1:1. and he talks about what does Genesis 1:1 mean when it says God created the heavens and the earth, these two things, right? The heavens and the earth. And cut to the chase, what Augustine actually says is that every single heavenly body in the night sky, even the most far-flung galaxy, Alpha Centauri, whatever the furthest galaxy out from our galaxy is, Augustine says that's included in Earth. Whenever Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, if you ask the question, okay, is Alpha Centauri included in heaven or in earth? Augustine says earth. That's kind of crazy, right? Put that in your pipe and smoke it. And that flies in the face of what C.S. Lewis is saying, I think, because what Augustine's doing is he's lumping Alpha Centauri in with Earth, aka the realm of nature. In radical contradistinction to what he calls heaven's heaven, or the heaven of heavens, which is where the angels are, okay? So remember that Sesame Street vignette, which of these three is not like the others? Remember that? One of the great things about Sesame Street is that an old dude like me and a young whippersnapper like you, we probably both watched Sesame Street. It's kind of awesome. And I'll bet that some of you remember that vignette, which of these three is not like the others, okay? So we've got three things: Earth, Alpha Centauri, and the unseen, unchangeable realm of the angels. Earth, Alpha Centauri, and the immaterial realm of the angels, which we haven't talked much about that at all. But you've got these three things. The question is, where are we going to put Alpha Centauri? Are we going to lump it in with Earth, or are we going to lump it in with the immaterial realm of the angels? And what Augustine says is we're going to lump it in with the earth. All right? That's kind of crazy. It's very interesting. By the way, if you're a Christian or a Jewish person and you care about what in the world Genesis 1 is saying, it's very good to pay attention to what Augustine says, in my humble opinion. But the point right now is that this flies in the face a little bit with C.S. Lewis's point. Although I still want you to understand C.S. Lewis's point, and quite frankly, I want you to agree with it. I want you to receive it. I want you to give it a high five. I want you to believe it because it's coming from C.S. Lewis. And he's right to say that one of the inherited beliefs of the medieval mind is this notion of the moon, which is kind of like the boundary line between the world of Fuchsius, the world of nature that changes, natura in Latin on the one hand, as opposed to the unchanging realm of the heavenly bodies on the other. Okay? Okay, I want to go to this third bullet point, but anyone want to say anything? Questions, comments? I hope I'm making sense.
What do they count the
Medieval
moon
philosophy.
as?
Sorry?
What do they count the moon as? You get the realm below the moon and you get the realm beyond the moon. What is the moon included in?
It's the dividing line.
Okay.
That's all I can say. Yeah, it's the dividing line. It's neither nor. It's the in-between. Okay? Good question, Jacob. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Michael, do you want to say anything about what I said about the confessions and creation, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I do remember that he made a distinct. I almost remember it like there's maybe rather than merely two categories, maybe three categories, or maybe like 2.5 categories. Because I remember he said I just remember he made it, and you said it actually, the heavens of the heavens or something like that, where it's like there's almost like little heaven and then big heaven, where it's like there's the earth and there's the heavens, and in a sense even the heavens are material, and that and I guess in that way lumped in with the earth. But then there's
So Michael,
Augustine also mentioned that there's something beyond even that, and so
oh yeah, Absolutely. But
So,
check
yeah.
it out. Genesis 1:1. Like in this context, Augustine takes himself to be commenting on Genesis 1:1. By the way, he wrote 3 commentaries on Genesis. There's the literal commentary on Genesis, another one that I can't remember right now, and book 12 and 13, I think, of the Confessions. Maybe books 11, 12, and 13. You can regard books 11, 12, and 13 of the Confessions as a commentary on Genesis. Yeah. So, Michael, I just want to reiterate, like, you're awesome, and you're probably right. However, in light of the fact that he's commenting on Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:1 talks about 2 things, not 3, not 2.5, 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's 2 things. And so what Augustine's trying to do is to make sense of reality in terms of those 2 categories, heaven and earth. And what's crazy is that he puts Alpha Centauri in the far-flung galaxies. I mean, if I held a gun to your head and said, which one would you choose? I think a lot of people would say, oh, surely, I mean, especially medievals, given what C.S. Lewis is saying about how the medievals tended to view everything on the other side of the orbit of the moon as unchanging. Doesn't that sound like the unmoved mover? Doesn't that sound like perfection, aka deity? Most medievals would probably want to say, oh, we're going to stick Alpha Centauri in the God bucket or the angels bucket, not the blooming, buzzing confusion bucket, not the bucket of nature where everything's changing all the time. And yet Augustine says, oh, no, I'm going to stick the far-flung galaxies in the bucket of the earth.
Right. So that does seem to contradict with the Augustine's thing does seem to contradict with the view that C.S. Lewis is describing.
Okay, good. Now I know that you are not confused, Michael, and that you're tracking with me and you're getting the concepts. High five. I wouldn't say that Augustine's contradicting it. I would say, I mean, it's just not quite that simple or black and white. It's not like C.S. Lewis is saying A and Augustine saying not A. It's a little more subtle than that. You might put it like this: Augustine is the exception that proves the rule. You might say that, or you might say that what C.S. Lewis is sort of describing not like an explicit doctrine, even that everyone is conscious of, but it's almost like a subconscious assumption that the medievals had. There's all sorts of things that you and I just sort of unconsciously assume, like, for example, that human beings have rights. Maybe you've never actually explicitly thought of that. You just sort of assume it. Or maybe that natural science is kind of like the arbiter of truth. Maybe you've not like rigorously reflected on that assumption. It's just kind of part of the background of your worldview. I think what C.S. Lewis is saying is that it is something like that. This is kind of like part of the background of the worldview of the medieval. So it's not exactly like a contradiction, but yes, there is a tension. And so, yes, you're right. You're right. Good. Okay. Y'all, look at the 3rd bullet point here. We might tend to assume that these ideas and beliefs are savage. This is C.S. Lewis's big point, that they emerge spontaneously from the encounter with a hostile natural world. This is kind of how the pagans roll, okay? But what C.S. Lewis shows us is that this is not so. Why do the medievals believe these things? How did they come to believe in these realities? Answer, they learned them in books. Theirs was a bookish, literate, textual culture. And that's true even if only 1% of the general population could read. It's still true. C.S. Lewis isn't saying that literate that medieval Europe was a literate society. He's not saying that. He's just saying that when it comes to the ideas that shaped the world, the people who propounded those ideas, they could read, and they didn't get their ideas from empirical observation or anything else. They got them from books. That's what he's saying. Okay. Let me read this footnote here. Oh yeah, this is exactly what I'm saying. Of course, we are here referring to the small percentage, this is footnote 1, of say Europeans who in the medieval world could read. Yeah. Okay. Now, y'all, I want to go for 7 more minutes. I've got 3:28. I want to go for at least 7 more minutes, not more than 10 more minutes, but I definitely want to get through chapter 1. The next thing that he talks about is this business of the model. Okay. And what should I say about the model? Let me read this. This is what this book is really about. The model is, quote, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single complex, harmonious totality. Okay. Let's see. Maybe I'll read a few lines. So on page 11, I'm going to read the paragraph at the top of page 11, but there is a third work. This is the medieval synthesis itself. So that word synthesis is important. It just means putting a bunch of stuff together. The whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. The building of this model is conditioned by 2 factors I've already mentioned. There is the essentially bookish culture of their culture, the essentially bookish character of their culture, and their intense love of system. Let me say 2 things about this notion of the model. First off, this is kind of like a theoretical construct that C.S. Lewis is developing. It's not like there's any one author who wrote a book called The Model. No. It's not like that. It's almost like an unspoken ideal that they all believed in. They all believed that reality is unified. Okay. Have y'all ever heard of something called the GUT, the grand unification theory, anything like that? Modern scientists used to talk about this like a couple of decades ago, like physicists, like trying to figure out what the ultimate laws of reality boil down to. It's kind of like that, although it also includes history and theology and have we talked in this class about the trivium and the quadrivium? Did we talk about that? I know we did in my intro class. So in the medieval universities, in the arts faculty, not the theology faculty, not the law faculty, but in the arts faculty, you had to study the arts, AKA the liberal arts, before you could graduate to theology. And in the arts faculty, you would study the trivium and the quadrivium. This is the 7 liberal arts, okay? So the trivium is logic, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium is, I think it's arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. I think arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, not astrology. C.S. Lewis talks about astrology in this chapter. No, not astrology, astronomy, and music. So in the arts faculty, they would study those 3 things. Well, what I'm trying to say to you right now, those 7 things. What I'm trying to say to you right now is that those 7 things were included in the model. Everything was included in the model. What I want to say to you, though, is that C.S. Lewis isn't saying that there's some medieval text that discusses the model exhaustively. That's not true. Although I would say that Dante's Commedia probably comes closer than anything, although it describes it in a poetic way, not a systematic way, but a poetic way. It's more like this was an aspiration or an ideal or an assumption that they very much believe in. Let me put it to you like this. You know how in our world, in our culture, we live in a culture in the West where we tend to celebrate diversity, right? We don't even believe that there's 2 genders. We believe that there's however many genders we want there to be, right? I mean, we believe in lots of different cultures. We don't believe that there's any unified truth in our culture. Your truth might be different from his truth. Now, I'm not saying that I, Matt Bolter, personally believe that, but that is a cultural assumption that we have. Okay? We in our culture, we privilege multiplicity and diversity way more than we privilege uniformity. You know, I could easily prove that to you, and I think that probably none of you disagree with it. But in the medieval world, it was totally different. They believed in uniformity. They kind of sort of thought that everyone should be the same in a way. They certainly thought that reality was the same. They thought that reality was one. And this is what C.S. Lewis is trying to get at when he talks about the model. Okay, now I want to talk about one more thing before we call it a day. And it's this word right here, dialectic. Because y'all, if you're thinking critically, and if you read C.S. Lewis closely, you should kind of sort of be detecting not a contradiction, Michael, but a big fucking tension. Definitely a big tension, okay? And the tension that we've already seen in this class right now is a tension between, on the one hand, this belief in uniformity. We just got done talking about that, did we not? This belief in uniformity on the one hand, C.S. Lewis calls it the model. And on the other hand, what? The respect of multiple authorities. Because guess what, people? The authorities contradict themselves, or at least kind of sort of contradict themselves, right? So C.S. Lewis has a great line in here somewhere in chapter 1. He basically says, for the medieval mind, if they read something in a book, it's as if they felt morally obligated to believe it. See, we live in a world in which we are default skeptics. I'm going to be talking about this when I talk about Descartes in my intro class in the next few days and weeks. Thanks to Descartes and so many other people, you and I are default skeptics. It's the habit of the modern mind. It's the habit of the modern mind. If you and I pick up an old book and read something, maybe a book that was written 500 years ago, our default tendency is to be skeptical of it. It just is. We tend to think that those, Neanderthals who lived hundreds of years ago were superstitious and ridiculous, and we are the enlightened ones. After all, we understand modern science. That is how the modern Western mind is habituated to think. If we read something in a dusty old book, we tend to disbelieve it. We tend to be skeptical of it. We have to work our asses off to prove to ourselves that, say, the Bible is true. Okay? Because the Bible is a dusty old book that is from a pre-modern age. It's kind of like, in order to convince ourselves that the Bible is true, we have to jump through a lot of hoops. For them, it's the very opposite. If they read something in a dusty old book, they feel morally obligated to believe it, to receive it, to accept it, okay? And that leads to a contradiction because on the one hand, these authorities do contradict themselves. As much as I've stressed to you and emphasized that Plato and Aristotle are on the same page, nevertheless, they have some disagreements, don't they? Yes, they do. We just saw how Augustine tends to undermine this idea that the heavenly bodies are somehow divine. That's a contradiction. Augustine contradicts other people like Aristotle and other people. So for the medievals, Augustine is an authority, Aristotle is an authority. They sort of contradict themselves, or at the very least stand in tension, and that leads to a problem. What is the problem? The problem is that we want everything to be unified. That's the model, right? So how in the heck are they going to solve this problem? All right, that's the question. How are they going to solve this problem between the lust for uniformity on the one hand and the respect of multiple authorities that potentially contradict themselves on the other? Do you see the problem? The question is, how are they going to solve this problem? And the answer could be stated with the word dialectic. Now, that word dialectic is a messy word. It's a complicated word. There's probably other words that we could use and that we will see in coming days and weeks, especially as we get into Thomas Aquinas, who developed what I call the Quaestio method. I'm going to put that in the chat. The Quaestio method. I'm going to put that in the chat. The Quaestio method. Here's what's crazy, y'all. Whenever we get to Thomas Aquinas and we read the 5 ways, and for those of you who are going to present on it / write papers on it, please listen up because you will thank me later. What Thomas Aquinas does in every single one of his questions and even articles is he entertains the position of multiple authors, and he puts them into discussion. What do we call that? What do we call that when different positions are put into discussion? I call it dialectic. Now, Plato engaged in dialectic, Aristotle engaged in dialectic. It's not like Thomas Aquinas has a monopoly on dialectic, no, but he certainly has his own version of it. So that the answer to the question, how are we going to deal with this problem between the quest for uniformity on the one hand and the presence of multiple authorities, all of whom we respect on the other? The solution to that problem is, to use my word, dialectic. We're going to see that when we look at the way Thomas Aquinas thinks. Thomas Aquinas is going to ask a big, complicated question like, can someone help me out? He's going to ask a big, complicated question like, I don't know, does God change? And he's going to say, Pseudo-Dionysius says this, Heraclitus says this, Augustine says this, the philosopher, aka Aristotle, says this. So there's 4 different views and they're all different. He honors all 4 of those views and he tries to put them into dialectic so that at the end of that process, he comes up with something like a distilled answer or his own version of the answer. Okay, we're going to see that more. I call that dialectic. I wish we had time to read page 11. Page 11. I'm going to read it right now and then we're going to close. Okay, page 11. They, the medievals, find it hard to believe that anything an old auctor has said is simply untrue, and they inherit a very heterogeneous. What does heterogeneous mean? It means diverse and lots of difference. They inherit a very heterogeneous collection of books: Judaic, pagan, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoical, primitive Christian, patristic. Obviously, their auctors will contradict one another. They will seem to do so even more often if you ignore blah, 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 blah. If you keep reading, he says, all the apparent contradictions must be harmonized. Now, I would put it a little differently than C.S. Lewis does there. I wouldn't want to say that Thomas Aquinas, and side note, you should really be thinking about Thomas Aquinas here. I mean, Thomas Aquinas is the paradigmatic medieval thinker, okay? So I would be willing to bet that even though C.S. Lewis is not a theologian, he's not a philosopher, nevertheless, in the back of his mind, he's kind of sort of thinking about Thomas Aquinas, maybe Anselm to a lesser degree. These thinkers, I wouldn't say that they harmonize. That word seems a little too easy and airtight and clean for me. I would say something like they employ a method of dialectic and try to come up with their own version of a solution. But they respect all of the authors and they try to incorporate them all into the method, so into the model. So one way to think about the model, and I will really and truly close with this, if you've ever been to Europe or maybe seen pictures of medieval cathedrals, and I encourage you to Google medieval cathedrals and look at as many pictures on Google Images as you can, that might be a good metaphor for the model. Yes, it includes lots of diversity, lots of different stones, lots of different mosaics, lots of different windows, lots of different arches, lots of different kinds of wood, lots of different gargoyles, lots of different kinds of stone, right? Lots of diversity, very heterogeneous is a medieval cathedral. And yet, would you not agree that a medieval cathedral is also one unified structure? A medieval cathedral has lots of diversity in it, but it's not celebrating the diversity in a way that a modern or postmodern person might want to do. A medieval cathedral embraces the diversity, yes, but they incorporate it in order to bring it into a larger unity, one beautiful thing. Okay, that might be a good metaphor for what C.S. Lewis means by the model. And y'all, next class, we will definitely talk about the heavens. It's going to be fun. I predict that we will also be able to talk about the earth and her inhabitants, which is a much longer section. But let me be quiet now and just ask, any thoughts, questions before we call it a day? This is probably the longest class we've had. That's okay. Good stuff. I hope that this, welcome to medieval philosophy. I hope that this helps you and that you find it interesting. All right. And I hope that for those of you who are going to present, it will be helpful, and I hope it'll help with papers as well. Any other thoughts, questions, comments before we call it a day? Going once, going twice. Peace out. Keep reading. And I will see you on Wednesday. Okay. Y'all take care. If anyone has any thoughts about meeting in person, please let me know. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.